Let's get first reaction from tonight's panel. Fox News military analyst, retired Major General Robert Scales. Kirsten Powers, columnist for the Daily Beast. KT McFarland, Fox News national security analyst, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles.
Well, I think he made the most coherent case he has up until now for a military action. I think it will have zero effect on the needle, either in Congress or in public opinion. But I'm glad he laid it out the way he did. There's one sort of contradiction underlying everything he said, which I think is gnawing away at people who ask, why us? He talks about international standards, international law, standing up for decency on behalf of all humanity. And yet there's not one country in the world outside of possibly France that is standing with the United States. So that makes a sham of the idea that this is somehow some statement by all of humanity, by the community of nations, as he calls them, which I believe is a fiction. And in fact, the only reason that the French are with us on this is because Syria and Lebanon are former semi-colonies that were given to France after the First World War. And as in West Africa, the French will act in places where they were the colonial power. So this is an expression of French nationalism. It isn't an expression of French altruism. So that's our one ally in the world. And remember, liberals, Democrats were the ones who excoriated the Bush administration for acting unilaterally in Iraq when it had almost 50 allies. So I think that's the core issue, and I'm not sure he addressed it in a way that will appease any of his opponents.
KT?
He said he wanted to deter Assad, degrade Assad's chemical weapons ability, and signal to the world. And he doesn't have a plan B. He's got this limited, targeted, very small footprint attack, no air power. And what happens if the day after, Obama says the day after, we're going to seek a diplomatic solution? Well, what happens the day after if Assad doesn't feel the same way? What if he escalates? I think he's probably going to be in a position where he has to do something to maintain his own credibility. So Obama doesn't seem to have a plan B. But what struck me, and I think is the most upsetting, is I remember being in the White House briefing room in 1972 when Henry Kissinger said about the Vietnam peace accords, he said, peace is at hand. This was right before the 1972 re-election of Nixon. And it turned out peace wasn't at hand. Nixon was re-elected. The North Vietnamese realized they could use that to play against it, and all of a sudden the negotiations, which looked like they were going to immediately result in a peace agreement, did not. And it wasn't until Nixon then had the Christmas bombing that brought the Vietnamese back to the table. So I'm worried that Obama set himself up for this, of saying, we're going to talk with the Russians, and if everybody calls his bluff, he is really going to be in trouble.
Kirsten, Secretary Kerry is going to Geneva. The President mentioned that. He still hasn't really squared the circle on this idea that it came out of conversations from the G20 summit, even though the State Department characterized Kerry's comments in London as off the cuff and a rhetorical argument. But we are where we are.
Right.
What's your thought of that speech?
Well, first it struck me as something that should have been done sooner, probably. That I think this is maybe a toned down version of what we heard from Susan Rice. It's with a little less of the, rhetorical flourish. But I think it was needed probably sooner in the debate. I don't think he said anything new that's probably going to shift anything. And frankly, I think Americans, he's right, they're war-weary, and they've kind of heard a similar story before. There's going to be no slippery slope. We don't need to be worried about it. And I don't think he said anything to make people feel like there's going to, that's not going to happen. Furthermore, they've been spending time talking about Assad as Hitler, right? So that's the circle that has not been squared. How can you just do these limited, targeted strikes, and that's basically it, when you have your Secretary of State comparing him to Hitler, when you have Harry Reid comparing him to Hitler?
The President General said that he's ordered U.S. military to maintain its position to keep pressure on Assad. Right. He also said the military does not do pinprick strikes.
Well, what he's trying to do, to use military speak, is he's trying to square the circle between means and ends. Means, it's essentially an unbelievably small pinprick. America has infinite military power, but this is a very, very limited exercise in terms of 100 cruise missiles. But look at the ends. What does he seek to achieve? He seeks to stop the use of chemical weapons. Good. He's also going to protect who? He mentioned Israel, he mentioned Turkey, he mentioned Jordan, he threatened Iran. Oh, and the capper was, if we fire these 100 cruise missiles, we're going to protect the American GI in any future war against the threat of chemical weapons. So instead of closing the gap between ends and means, I think in this speech he widened it. Look, military force is good for winning wars. It's not good at nuance or restoring credibility and things of that sort. Military force is force.
General, panel, thank you. We'll have more from